Adam, when thinking about the 70s, what do you think is maybe most forgotten or most underappreciated about that decade? Because obviously games are tape delay. There's difference if the games are even aired at all. There's a lot less exposure. There's a league struggling to survive. What do you think is overlooked about the 70s that maybe you wish the casual basketball fan knew more about?
Well, I think maybe its greatest strength was also its greatest weakness. So it's often called decade of parity. There was no great team that is you could point to like the '60s Celtics or the '50s Lakers or the '80s Lakers Celtics or the '90s Bulls. I mean, you can point to pretty much every decade, and there's a dynasty. The 1970s didn't have that. The Washington Bullets, under a variety of names, made the finals more than any other team in the decade. And we don't think of the 1970s Bullets as being a dynasty, and they weren't. But I think that that's one thing that people overemphasize is we like a dynasty. We like a story, again, a story of winners, and they didn't have that in the 70s. And so to me, I look at the parity as a good thing. It meant that literally every year any team had a chance, or at least 75% of teams had a chance. Whereas I think it gets a bad rap for not having that dynasty that other decades enjoyed.
That's so interesting because right now in the modern NBA, as I'm sure you're aware, we are in a period of parity. I mean, greater than certainly what we saw in the 2010s, where if you had LeBron James, you're basically in the NBA finals. Do you think that just from like a league business perspective, it truly is a benefit for the league to have dynasties?
100%. I think that it's easy because it's easy to market not only the dynasty but also the upsetting the dynasty, right? Like if let's say for example hypothetically the Celtics continue to roll through and they win this year and they win next year, or even just win this year, I think they're now the dynasty. They're now the big bad Celtics, and everybody's going to be looking for ways to take them down. And I think the last team we really saw that with was maybe the Warriors, maybe the Cavs, or the late, Cavs of the late LeBron era.
Yeah.
I think that the having dynasties is good for the NBA because again, it gives them you have a villain or you have somebody to celebrate. And 1970s kind of lack that, and in fact, they're arguably the best player in the league at the time was Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who the media hated. And so there wasn't a dynasty. The most best player in the league wasn't really marketable. And so the league struggled with a lot of that. And it is interesting, as you brought up the parity, that really this is the first time since the 70s that we've had, I would agree, that lack of a dynastic team.
Why do people hate dynasties, though? Is it just fun to complain about them? Because all the time you hear, the Patriots, people hate them. The Cowboys of the '90s, people hate them. Just you go through history. It doesn't matter what league, people just hate dynasties. But yet they complain when they're not there. So is it just fun to hate them? Is it just kind of like the complaining's part of it?
Absolutely. And I think the two examples I have for that I always point to with my students when I teach sport history is that Muhammad Ali studied Gorgeous George, the wrestler from the 1950s who was hated, but people bought a ticket to see him lose. The other thing that this reminds me of is Elvis Presley's manager sold Elvis Presley memorabilia and also Elvis Sucks buttons because Elvis is still making the money on the Elvis is great or the Elvis sucks buttons. And so I think that, you're right that I immediately thought of Patriots when talking about a dynasty is like they tuned in to watch them and they wanted them to lose or to win. And I feel like, in the modern NBA, if you had a team that rose up to be, and I would argue like the Heatles, the LeBron James, D Wade, Chris Bosh, like people wanted to see them lose because they were assembled the wrong way. And I think that like the NBA has to kind of like that. They have to like those stories of, watching Goliath be beaten by David or at least challenged by David. And so, yeah, I think that plays a big role.
Is just staying on modern NBA real quick. Myself and Matt were talking about this, off air a few minutes ago. Is that why you think Jokic, for example, he's a phenomenal player, just put up historic numbers, but yet he just doesn't get that love in terms of being an elite player. Usually he's forgotten about, other storylines take over, and, he only gets really discussed when you're talking about maybe MVP or, winning a championship in, June. But yeah, he's not that through storyline because he just kind of goes out there and does his job. Similarly to Tim Duncan, there's not that kind of hateable quality about him. He's just phenomenal. That's what he does. But there's really kind of, for a casual fan, there's not that connection to him.
Absolutely. And I think that, and maybe it would be different if he played in New York or he played in LA. But I feel like, yeah, you're right. I mean, he's he's eminently kind of vanilla. He doesn't really move the needle, I think, for a lot of casual fans. He's great. He's fun to watch, but he doesn't have, like you said, those storylines. I think people are far more invested in maybe how Karl Anthony Towns does in New York, or how Julius Randle does in Minnesota, or how Zach Edey does in Memphis, right? Like those are needle movers way more than Jokic, who's arguably a better player than any of those three. I think it's unarguably better than those three. And you're right. For whatever reason, there hasn't been a lot of storylines. Maybe it's because he just is steady, and you can kind of count on him. He's not eminently quotable, but no, I mean, you're right. And he's very much, to bring it back historically in some ways, he kind of epitomizes some of the stars of the 70s, and that he just kind of goes about his business, gets his job done, and most casual fans just don't care. They can't be bothered by him.